Hey everyone, we are moving on from the Enlightenment, but we are going to talk about an event that was inspired by Enlightenment ideals, that being the overthrow of the absolute monarchy in France, better known as the French Revolution. By the time this video has concluded, you should be able to explain some of the causes of the French Revolution, for example, the estate system, which, if you're in my class, we talked about very briefly when we talked about Louis XIV, but we're going to go into more detail about the estate system here. We're going to trace the reasons why the French citizens were so angry at the monarchy and at their situation in general, leading to a revolt or a revolution against the powers that be. And you should be able to identify specific actions that were taken that led to the revolution. Also be able to define these terms. The estate system, estates general, the tennis court oath, the National Assembly, and the Bastille. Okay, so off we go. Here is a brief look at what things looked like in France leading up to the revolution. French society, for many, many years, had been divided into three pretty rigid class systems, and they were called estates. The first estate was about 0.5% of the population, a very small number, and that was the clergy, the men of God in the Catholic Church. They were considered the first estate because they were the closest to God, so they were at the top. The second estate was the nobility. That was about 1.5%. And then the other 98%, everybody else, was the third estate. That was the commoners. About 10% of that would be what you would now call middle class, people who were merchants, lawyers, people like that, that were typically more well educated. But vast majority of the third estate was peasants. Okay. The third estate resented the upper classes because of the privileges they enjoyed. They didn't have to pay taxes, and the top two estates, which is only 2% of the population in France, owned almost a third of all land in the country. So this very small number of people controlled large amounts of the country's wealth and power, which is obviously going to make the third estate incredibly unhappy. Now, there are plenty of economic troubles. A lot of revolutions throughout history have begun because the common people were poor or had a specific, particular, calamity befall them that led to widespread famine or panic. There was no money. We talked about Louis XIV in the last unit on absolutism and his building of the palace at Versailles and having these very lavish courts with these big ceremonies and concerts and spending gobs of money on the military. And so as a result, the coffers, the bank account of the French government was drained. That was exacerbated or made worse by several wars the French took part in the 1700s, such as the French and Indian War in North America and the 7 Years' War in Europe. And again, the people who have the money, the nobility, didn't pay taxes and had no interest in paying taxes and helping foot the bill for these wars and these extravagant costs. So despite the fact that the French government, the people in power, are running up enormous bills, it fell to the peasants to actually have to pay for all of that, which is obviously going to make them angry. There was also a big food shortage in France in the late 1700s, in large part created by a shortage of bread. There were several very, very bad harvests of grain years in a row, which led to a shortage of bread, which, if you're a poor peasant, is your primary source of sustenance. So that's not optimal, obviously. There also weren't any changes made despite the fact that things were going badly in France. Louis XIV was succeeded by Louis XV, who was pretty weak as a ruler and didn't do a whole lot to make anything better. The extravagant spending, the frivolous building projects continued, and the economic situation in France continued to deteriorate, and a lot of the fallout from that fell on the peasantry, the lowest class. So, since there were a lot of people unhappy by 1789, there are riots in the streets over the lack of bread. The people are incredibly unhappy. Louis XVI did something that Louis XIV and XV never did. and he called a meeting of the Estates General, which is an assembly of representatives from all three of the estates. And when they met in 1789, it was their first meeting since the year 1614, 175 years since they had been called. Because again, France is an absolute monarchy, so they're not going to pay attention to any kind of assembly that tells them what to do if you're the monarch there. The Third Estate had plenty of grievances or complaints, but there wasn't a whole lot they could do. The Estates General was set up in a way that colluded to block them out. Each estate got one vote. So no matter how many people were there from each individual estate, the first estate collectively got one vote, the second estate got one vote, and the third estate got one vote. And the first and second estate, as you can imagine, were generally going to vote together because they were the privileged ones. So in essence, in the Estates General, when a vote was held, the first and second estate would always outvote the third 2-1. So 98% of the population would get outvoted by 2% of the population. That sounds fair, right? Well, the third estate got tired of this, and they broke away and formed their own assembly. They basically took their ball and went home. And they called it the National Assembly, and they said that they were the true representatives of the people, that they had France's and the French citizens' best interests in mind, unlike the first two estates who only wanted to protect their own wealth and their own power. And they started meeting to try to write a constitution for France's government. In large part, they were inspired by the United States, which in 1787, 2 years earlier, had written its U.S. Constitution. Well, the National Assembly was not going to go on unharassed, and eventually they found their meeting hall locked. They showed up one day to continue meeting about the Constitution, and the doors were locked. It was guarded. They said, no, you're not getting in. So they decided to go elsewhere. They convened at the closest place they could find. They went to an indoor tennis court. And today you would call it like a racquetball court or a handball court. But you see a picture of it there. It's kind of a gymnasium-looking area. And they swore an oath to each other that they would continue to meet until they had established a new written constitution for the French government. And that oath is known as the tennis court oath. So, as the National Assembly is meeting, as they're trying to develop a new constitution, unrest is growing, the monarchy is getting nervous, and Louis XVI begins to assemble the military and have them guard key areas of Paris, which is the French capital. And it really hit the fan on July 14th, 1789, where a group of peasants descended on an old fortress and prison called the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison. It had a few people in it. Most of them were in jail for piddly offenses like counterfeiting and stuff like that. But it was also a munitions depot, and they had weapons and gunpowder and stuff like that. It was essentially a fort. And a fight broke out outside the Bastille when the peasants demanded to get their hands on the munitions that were inside. A crowd continued to grow, and it broke out into a full-scale riot, essentially. And eventually the peasants overtook the Bastille, stormed it, killed all the guards, paraded their heads on stakes throughout the streets of Paris, showing that they were, basically mad and not going to take this anymore. And this is where the French Revolution is said to have begun. Louis XVI heard about this happening. He was told by his members of court what had occurred at the Bastille, and he looked at them and he said, "So what is this? Is this a revolt?" And one of them said, "No, sire, this is a revolution." So I leave you there. As we go on in this unit, if you're one of my students, we will talk about what happened during the French Revolution and the aftermath, and how this absolute monarchy in France gives way to an entirely new form of government. As always, ask your teachers if you have any questions. Cheers.